Okay. Um, Welcome to Breakout Room 3. So my name is Yi-Hsien. I am the Associate Professor of Teaching at the University of Southern California. And so today we have 3 amazing presentations, and each presentation is 15 minutes. We'll do presentation first. So 3 presentation will go first, and please reserve your question until the very end, but feel free to write your question in the chat. And then please know that when you're done with the session, do not close the breakout room. Simply click the option of leave the breakout room at the end of this panel. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first presenter, Olga Klimova from University of Pittsburgh. And her presentation is Rewarding, Not Penalizing in the Russian Language Classroom, Alternative Grading as a Response to the Mental Health Crisis. Welcome, Olga.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here on Friday morning, Friday afternoon. So I will start because we have limited time. And I wanted to start by saying that what I'm going to discuss today is basically how the introduction of alternative grading and the badge system in my Russian language program at the University of Pittsburgh has allowed me to motivate my students and also encourage them to study for proficiency and not for grade. It also has made a positive impact on my students' emotional and mental health, as well as I believe has created like a stronger, healthier, enthusiastic communities of learners who are willing to take more risks in the classroom, who are focusing more on their progress and their proficiency. So, and finally, my conclusions from using this system, right, introducing this system into my curriculum is that this alternative grade and also the badge system have allowed me not only to improve the students' performance in our language classrooms, specifically at the elementary level and intermediate, when they're still doing like taking these classes for gen-ed requirements, right, or for the certificate in Russian East European studies, but not necessarily they're still planning to use it for their future careers. So, but this system of alternative grading have allowed me also to have a positive impact on the retention in the classroom and also recruitment, because the students talk, they share that this is a really fun and effective class with no or minimal stress, and they still leave the classroom with a lot of positive results. So just a quick overview why I'm focused on the mental health issue is just because in my classroom, I've noticed over the past 4 or 5 years, it became a very, it started playing a very important role. It has become a very important factor in how I develop my curriculum, how I teach in my classroom. So, and if you notice at this data from the Mental Health America, definitely between 2019 and 2021, the numbers of anxieties, cases of anxieties and depression have increased, and you will notice pretty drastically. And of course, I was able to observe these tendencies in my classroom. So today, what I've from the literature, from the academic literature, I found out that the increase of cases of depression and anxieties have been going on for the past probably like a decade, and it's also was the number of students who are depressed and anxious increased even before the pandemic. But of course, with the pandemic, has contributed to the even more cases of mental health issues and emotional sensitivity among our students. And of course, we cannot, as educators, we cannot ignore this anymore, and we have to re-envision our pedagogical approaches to address this elephant in the room, right? So, and what is for me as an indicator, I believe that enduring empathy and also making sure that flexibility is a key component in my classroom, and also the compassion-centric approach is something that is driving my pedagogy nowadays. And what I also noticed that, and of course we already heard this in our keynote speaker discussion, that grades and systematic grading bias very often may create unfairness between students. And nowadays we are striving to create the inclusive, fair environment in our classroom. And I think in language classroom it is especially essential because they're small classrooms, very intimate environment with the smaller groups of students, and this becomes even more paying more important attention, so or more important role. So why I was even exploring this this introduction of new modified grading system, it's for several reasons. Of course, it's the change of learning environment. I already mentioned pandemic, mental health crisis. Also, I've noticed also the increased uneven proficiency levels in elementary intermediate Russian classrooms. We would have more heritage speakers coming into our classroom even from the very beginning, but even though we would place them into the high levels, they would feel so anxious and stressed out. They would go and try the high level and they would still come back and say, no, I have to be at the low level because it's too stressful for me. So, and also we have noticed the increased number of students who officially registered with the Office of Disability and who would require some additional accommodations. And overall, I also noticed more and more students would behave in the classroom differently from the students who were in my classroom 10 years ago or 18 years ago. They're more emotional, they're more sensitive to the criticism, to like correcting to have these mistakes corrected publicly in the classroom. Sometimes even if something was not working, they might even express some kind of emotional distress. They might shut down or they might start even crying. So that's definitely something that I had to take into consideration. And of course, because of all these accommodations, because of all these students in my classroom, I had to make changes because it also added an extra work for me, right? To meet all these accommodations, it increased my workload. And more students also start taking incompletes at the end of the course. They would ask, like, they wouldn't be able to keep up with the grades, especially at the end of the semester when it become more stressful and time consuming with their other final exams and projects that need to be completed. And in drop of the in enrollments since the pandemic for all language programs became very important, but also for us, for the Russian program, it's the war in Ukraine in February 2022 when Russia attacked Ukraine. It also added an additional factor, right? Emotional and mental health factor that triggered many students, because we have students from heritage speakers from Ukraine, from Russia. We also have students who take this very personal, and overall this also this new environment, right? This new reality has affected our interest of students in Russian major. So less students would get enrolled in these classes, especially at the novice level, first year and second year, or they don't want to continue after they fulfill the language requirement. So what was the positive, of course, was that I already was familiar with some complete and incomplete system, right? So already 60-70% of our activities in these two levels were complete and incomplete. We also already use self and peer grading strategies. We use portfolios in our language classroom. So it was not revised completely, but it was adding on, right? And making additional modifications. So also, like, I had an experience gamifying one of my advanced level courses in 2017. So I've been exploring more like the theory of gamification in language classroom. So it also helped. And our Russian language curriculum in first and second year Russian is a hybrid curriculum, which allows for more flexibility. So, of course, the goals were for these modifications were numerous, but among them was to reduce student stress level, to save some time on grading, to motivate them to learn, and to not to punish them, but to catch them when they're falling and support them. Also discourage them from cheating, encourage students to take responsibility for their own learning, and also to make sure that we get the more accurate reflection of students' learning outcomes, and provide with more useful feedback, and encourage our students to focus more on their proficiency, on their progress and improvement, rather than on these digits. So what we have in our intermediate and elementary Russian, we have specs grading. So we kind of have a combined methodology approaches, grading approaches. We have specification grading, specs grading, we have contract grading. Also, we still have portfolios at the end of each semester. And we this semester have introduced a badge system. So the course requirements, we list all these course requirements, and there are all these different components which focus all on speaking, listening, reading comprehension, all the modes. But we created these grade bundles, and that describe each letter grade, right? We still have to follow the final grade because students want to get this grade at the end in their transcripts, but we describe it as what this each bundle is entitled, right? So it's entitles. So if we have different projects, we have digital portfolios, quizzes, tests, and there is a description of what each of this bundle, how they are supposed to perform in order to get this bundle. So they do have a small commitment in the beginning when we do this survey, the initial survey. So they choose the bundle, but of course they are allowed to switch in the middle of the semester. We provide them with detailed holistic rubrics. So it's, as you can see, it's a description of what is to have this task complete, and what it means that if it's task is incomplete. So we have them for oral tests, we have all them for like written tests and projects, etc. So, and this is how the system is split up. This is all the different tasks that they have to complete throughout the semester. They all are based on complete and complete. And I do have at the bottom, as you can see, I'm trying to still to convert these points, these bundles, into the letter grade, because that's what I have to record in my faculty center at the end of the semester. So students get also the percentage of like what they, how much each task, each assessment weight in this course. We also, in order to be more flexible again and more forgiving and more rewarding, we allow them to use specific number of attendance or live tokens. And this is the tokens that they can take in no questions asked why they're missing specific classes, and they can have a specific number of live tokens depending on the bundle to which they commit. There are also deadlines and late work tokens, because we've noticed since the pandemic, the students are missing, the time management has become a problem, and they're missing more and more deadlines. So unfortunately, when we introduced, this is already the third year we are testing this pro system. What I've noticed also that sometimes students will start abusing this alternative grading system, and they will be less motivated to do things on time because they know that they can be, they have all this system of redos, right? If it's not up to the criteria is 80 to 85% and above. So they might not even prepare for this activity. They might not prepare for the quiz. So I had to introduce this leaderboard system and the badges. And this is the first semester we are testing it out. And it allows also for students to develop academic leadership skills, motivate them to not, for example, not to do their best from the very beginning. It's also allowed us to better understand and explain them what an outstanding work means in the classroom, exceptional work, and also to help us to track and to make it more visible students' progress and performance, and create a more healthy environment with competition, but also with collaboration, because in the next slide, I'll show you what this digital badge system looks like. It's every week, it's for different helping your friends, not missing classes, for creativity, speaking only in the target language, rapid progress, submission on time, no need to redo, and like participating in outside the extracurricular activities. So, and students responded very positively to all these changes in our grading system. And as you can see, I collected the quantitative and qualitative data. So students, many of them noticed that they're not stressed out because failing tests, they get the opportunity to redo. They focus on their success, on their proficiency, rather on their letter grades. And they feel more encouraged to study and learn, and not just like for a short period, but for the long term. And they also, all the students noticed, this is a question that the university asked us to add to our final students' evaluations about fairness of grading. And as you can see, all our students agree that they believe that this system of grading is fair. So, and as I noticed, this is just my final notes, that most of the students, it continued into the next semester, because if in the past, the passing grade C- and above is the university policy for language prerequisite, was a challenging. Some students, because of their different learning abilities and skills, they would fail the course and they would not continue in the next semester. Now we give them opportunity not to fail. We provide them with more individualized instructions and feedback. We're creating a more healthier, welcoming environment for them. And also we allow them to practice the real life work environment, because in the work environment, you're not going to be fired from your job if you miss a deadline, right? They might allow you to do. And also the reward system is like a bonus system, right? So, and some things, of course, need to be taken into consideration, like the rubrics need to be more clear and simple. There is more work from the instructor in the beginning to plan all this stuff, all this grading system. Some students do not follow the bundles, but of course, I would recommend to have it more flexible, and need to be more explanation for students. And when they understand everything, they actually participate in this system. And what I've noticed, even from week 1 to week 3, the badge system allows students to become more actively involved. They are striving for better. They're trying to get more badges, because there are small prizes attached to these badges, but the prize.
I'm sorry, time is up, so 10 seconds.
So, and
thank you.
The time is, and the prizes is for them to get like positive results at the end of the course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga, for like excellent grasp of the time. And then we will going to move on to our second presentation. Please continue to ask questions in the chat, or hold your question until the very end. We'll have Q&A section. So our second presentation is from Elara Sherman from Emory University. And her title is Empowering Students or Performing Freedom, Ungrading, and the Hidden Tyranny of Contracts.
Hello, everyone. So yeah, my name is Elara Sherman. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. And I'm so excited to be here and to listen and learn from all of you, and to be able to get some feedback on this presentation, which is titled Empowering Students or Performing Freedom, Ungrading, and the Hidden Tyranny of Contracts. So I'm currently in my 4th year of a PhD studies program in French at Emory University. And in my research, I work on narratives of intimacy in contemporary French-speaking women's writing. My work focuses on women's literature from around the world to problematize the ways we craft political narratives about race, sexuality, and disability, and the intimate daily dynamics of power that characterize the lived experiences of marginalized groups. And one of the main things I'm interested in is in the ways writers like Calixte Béala, Linda Lay, and Marie Vieux-Chauvet challenge the tools used by resistance movements. So their interventions into political discourses of health, exile, state legitimacy, critically question what it means to use a feminist decolonial methodology. And their writings, I would suggest, echo Audre Lorde's famous warning, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." So this idea of what tools we use to disrupt power dynamics in the classroom is the subject of my presentation at its most general. While I've been very, very inspired by the work of scholars using labor-based grading contracts, and think there are amazing resources in this work that can benefit students, I do have some reservations that I want to talk about regarding the efficacy of the contract as a tool in ungrading. So my main argument is that contracts do not inherently empower students. In fact, the violence of contracts consists in large part of the way they are used to construct an alibi for powerful institutions. The appearance of freedom granted by a contract, either through a tacit agreement or formal signature, works to hide mechanisms of structural racism rather than disrupt them. I propose that truly empowering students in our ungrading practices requires reckoning with the violence of contracts and the links between social contract theory and the contract ideology that exists explicitly or implicitly in the classroom today. So part one, labor-based grading contracts. So in the context of this presentation, I'm focusing on Asal B. Inouye's model of labor-based grading contracts. His book, Labor-Based Grading Contracts, Building Equity and Inclusion in the Compassionate Writing Classroom, has been an influential resource for students in various disciplines in academia. And like many people, I believe the free resources he provides were some of the first I encountered when I started to think about ungrading. So this is just a brief overview of how Inouye sees labor-based grading contracts as benefiting students, particularly students of color. So first, this ungrading method calculates final course grades purely by the labor students complete, not by any judgments of the quality of their writing. Focusing on labor rather than quality, Inouye argues, resists racist and white supremacist grading systems, which privilege dominant modes of languaging. Inouye argues that grading by a standard is an inherently racist practice. Two, because the instructor in a labor-based system has removed standards of quality, students feel more open to taking risks. They can be creative without fear of punishment if their teacher doesn't like the way they completed the assignment. Three, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Grades get in the way of learning for learning's sake, encouraging students to focus on how to get a good grade rather than improve the ways they language. Contract-based grading encourages students to develop their ability to weigh the feedback of their peers and teacher, taking some comments and letting others go, rather than simply following orders. And number four, labor-based contract grading encourages students to see their labor as a practice over time, working within conditions that are sometimes beyond our control, which has several implications. So for one, labor logs and regular reflection assignments on their labor encourage students to think about strategies of labor that work best for them individually, taking into account their lives outside of school and their mental health. And labor-based contract grading makes visible the labor required by students in the hidden curriculum. So it helps students begin to navigate the unfair conditions that keep them from doing good labor in class. So part two is a critique of labor in Inouye's labor-based contract grading. Responding to Inouye's call for engagement from disability scholars, Ellen C. Carrillo's The Hidden Inequities in Labor-Based Contract Grading rejects the concept of labor as a truly liberatory and effective model for students with disabilities. The normative body, she argues, is, quote, at the center of the labor-based grading contract, end quote. For example, when the instructor in a labor-based system estimates how long it will take to complete an assignment, they fail to take into account how different students labor differently. This has implications not only for students with disabilities, but also for students from first generation and low-income backgrounds who are disproportionately students of color and who will be required to perform extra labor in order to complete assignments. While anyways, labor logs may help make this extra labor visible, Carrillo argues that it does not necessarily reward extra labor in a significant way. So she therefore proposes an adjustment from a labor-based to an engagement-based contract model. The latter, she argues, would reject a single normative standard of labor and offer students more flexible methods to engage in class. So what I think both Inoue and Carrillo seem to take at face value is the second part of labor-based contract grading, which is the contract. So this leads me to part 3, contract ideology in the classroom. Labor-based grading contracts, and I would assume engagement-based contracts as well, rewrite the traditional syllabus in terms of a contract. So Inoue's grading contract template begins by introducing students to the labor-based grading system, explaining the pedagogical benefits, followed by course goals and labor expectations. And then the end of the contract reads, by staying in this course and attending class, you accept this contract and agree to abide by it, in effect, signing it. I, Asal, also agree to abide by the contract and administer it fairly and equitably. Anyways, reframing of the traditional syllabus allows instructors who are required to assign final grades some freedom in fostering deeper student engagement with the process rather than the products of learning. The contract creates transparency about how students will be evaluated and alleviates student anxiety. And Inoue notes in his book that his class is able to go through a renegotiation process of their contract mid-semester, after which point the contract will not change. So I see these methods as, on the one hand, a way to give students a sense of stability and safety through the clarity of a contract, while on the other hand, treating this as a living document that can adapt to students' changing needs and goals over the course of the semester. Although the focus on labor significantly changes the tone and form of the traditional syllabus, I think it's important to note that the idea of a syllabus as a contract is not really a new thing in academia. So both Warner and Kaufman, for example, describe the tradition in academia of framing course syllabi as contracts between instructors and students. Kaufman goes on to emphasize that, quote, when students have sued their professors or institutions for breach of contract related to course syllabi, courts have dismissed those cases on the grounds that a syllabus is not a contract, end quote. So that is, a syllabus is not legally binding and therefore it's not literally a contract, even if we're framing it as such in the classroom. So why then do we continue to call syllabi contracts? Whether a student finds themselves in a course that uses labor-based grading contracts or a traditional grading system, they may encounter this rhetoric of syllabus as contract. Why is that? And what makes the contract such an attractive term in academia? So I want to suggest one possible answer to this question lies in the university's relationship to social contract theory. Proposed initially by the thinkers Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Locke in the 17th and 18th centuries, this school of thought was influential to the project of settler colonialism in early America. So John Locke, for example, had investments in the slave trade and assisted in the writing of the slave constitution of Carolina, and used his theory of the social contract to engage in racist practices in the United States. So in simplest terms, the social contract theory attempts to address a problem in political philosophy of how to establish a government's legitimacy. So why should we obey the state's laws? What makes a ruler legitimate and not simply a tyrant? Locke argued that when someone uses the services of a government, think like using the highway, for example, they enter into an unspoken agreement to be governed. That is, they have agreed to a social contract, which is not a literal contract, but rather a way to demonstrate the legitimacy of the state through a minimum threshold of consent by its subjects. So it's probably easy to see why in it's probably easy to see, like in our current political moment, why this standard of consent has been heavily criticized by feminist scholars, notably in Carol Pateman's book, The Sexual Contract. Right?
Elara, 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. So lots of work has been done in the humanities on the harm the contract paradigm does in thinking freedom. So here's a brief quotation from Charles Mills, who tracks Locke's use of labor to talk about dispossession of First Nation lands. But I'm going to skip over this real quick for the sake of time. So this is what I want to do in this presentation. Like, I want to draw a similarity between the way social contract theory uses the contract to rationalize the colonial position and the ways the contract in the classroom is justifying the teacher's position. So in A Syllabus is Not a Contract, Warner points out that the joining of a contract is a mutual agreement between two freely operating parties. And if we think about general education requirements, for example, whether or not the student and the teacher are on equal footing is really up for debate. Like, and even when the instructor has the best of intentions, I think when the students see a contract at the beginning of the semester, they can tell that they don't really have much options about whether or not to consent to it. So if the contract is the main tool by which we're telling ourselves we've achieved equity in our classrooms, then I think we have a big problem. On the other hand, if the contract is not the main tool we're using to create equity, then I wonder why we're using this rhetoric at all. So I think there's tons of stuff in labor-based grading, for example, that doesn't really rely on the contract itself. But I want us to think about why do we seem devoted to this tool? So in conclusion, the debate surrounding labor-based grading and the legacy of social contract theory in the university classroom leads me to suggest, one, regular discussions with students about labor inequity and the pressures that university life and more broadly neoliberal capitalist life puts on productivity. So shifting our expectations as teachers from the hope that labor will guarantee equity to thinking about labor-based grading as a way to survive in these conditions. Two, removing contracts from the labor-based grading contract does not necessarily eliminate contract ideology from our classrooms. However, shifting from a syllabus as contract model to a syllabus as a manifesto, for example, of one's teaching philosophy, might be a way to avoid the harmful language of contracts. Three, acknowledging that students are not freely choosing to enroll in our classes or even in the university, right? It helps to attend to the ways the dynamics of power in our classrooms, without repeating a problematic rhetoric that serves to legitimize the university system. And fourth and finally, grappling with our anxieties rather than trying to discharge them completely. So we talk about the contract eliminating student anxiety, but I think a large part of the work that contract does is like soothe teacher and administrator anxieties. I think instructor anxiety about this power differential can sometimes lead us to trying to solve an unsolvable problem through establishing the appearance of student consent. However, I would argue it's more productive to sit in this anxiety, grapple with it, rather than get rid of our unease completely or try to obtain student consent to university, departmental, and individual instructors' policies. Okay, I hope I didn't go too fast. Thank you all for listening. Here's my works cited, and I can share this if anybody wants it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elara. And then we'll move on to our third presentation. And please feel free to drop your question in the chat. Our third presentation is by Christina Beaubien with Westfield State University and Andie, Kansas State University. And their title is Reflecting Multilingual Values on Grading for Equity in the World Language Classroom.
Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Christina Beaubien from Westfield State University. And on behalf of my friend and colleague, Dr. Andie Fabe from Kansas State University, first we'd like to thank the organization of this conference today, providing a space for educators and scholars of ungrading to come together, talking about its nuance in the language and culture classes. Also, thank you, Elara, for your presentation on contracts. We Andie and I do a contract-based grading system. And as we'll see, one of the things we definitely talk about is it's not just about the contract. It's about the quotidian sort of interactions you have with the students. It's about policies, some of the ones that Olga implemented in her presentation, being flexible. And so what we're going to present today is sort of an amalgam of our approach to providing more multilingual values and equity in the world language classroom. So first, we'll start with discussing some of the values that Andie and I consider apparent and what we want to do in our classes, but maybe sometimes aren't necessarily so obvious. We're then going to look at how grading versus ungrading systems inhibit or support or perhaps challenge those world language values. We'll then discuss our methodology, what we titled contract-based grading, and how it looks in the classroom. And then last but not least, we will reflect on some of our student reactions to this research and the methodology that we've completed.
Unmute. So when Christina and I started this project, we sat down and thought, let's backward design this puppy. What are our goals and values that are really important to us, that are at the heart of what we're trying to do in our world language classes? And so we got together with our expertise, Christina as a scholar of literary and cultural studies, and me as a linguist who specializes in second language acquisition and bilingualism, as well as our collective decades of experience as language learners and language educators. And we put together our goals and values. So first, for us, number one is fostering global literacy while developing target language skills. With things, we have the world readiness standards, actual proficiency standards, and can-do statements that we can heavily rely upon that help us support developing intercultural competence, autonomy, critical thinking, collaboration, problem solving, in addition to language proficiency. We also want to challenge purist language ideologies of the traditional world language classroom. These standard language ideologies and prescriptivist perspectives that view language as a static set of rules with right and wrong answers rather than a set of dynamic, ever-evolving practices to allow for communication. We want to embrace emerging multilingual identities because we know that bilingual speakers are not two monolingual speakers in one person, and our students will never be monolingual speakers of the target language. We want them to see their bilingualism as an asset, not as a problem. We also want to value engagement, risk-taking, and questioning so that students feel ownership over their language learning journey. Because although language learning is an individual process with variable outcomes, research in second language acquisition shows that motivation and investment are key factors in successful language development. So we want to make sure that we're supporting that. We also want to encourage thoughtful and intentional reflection so that students are learning to evaluate their own goals and progress. As Susan Bloom mentioned in her keynote earlier, these are key characteristics in supporting lifelong learning and helping students to be able to evaluate their own learning. And finally, we want to honor the acquisition process, which we know is not linear. Just because we've taught something doesn't mean that students have acquired it. So those are our goals, and that's what we looked at. So then we're thinking about how can we assess and evaluate our students, looking at grading versus ungrading. So with traditional grading systems, research shows 3 reliable effects when students are graded. They tend to think less deeply, avoid taking risks, and lose interest in the learning itself. Some of additional research that has come through in evaluating traditional grading practices has to do with, encouraging competition over competition over collaboration, failing to provide meaningful feedback. They offer a fixed point of attainment that does not reflect growth necessarily in a student. They perpetuate systems of privilege and oppression so that students who come in with a stronger academic background tend to get higher grades. They discourage risk-taking and growth. Students tend to be much more conservative in their production when they feel like they're being evaluated on their errors rather than on what they're able to do. And finally, with our world language context, traditional grading practices undermine linguistic diversity and inclusivity. Again, with this idea that there's a right way to conjugate a verb and a wrong way to conjugate verbs, which can say that even some native speakers don't know their own language. And that's not something that we want to promote. So then we go into ungrading practices. And ungrading is an umbrella term to describe assessment practices that challenge the status quo and are designed to recenter students' attention on learning and away from the metrics. We can do this in a variety of ways. One way would be minimal grading, just simplifying the scale to make things clearer and simpler for students. We have student-generated rubrics, which bring students into the process of evaluation. Goal setting, asking students what they want to get out of their learning. Process letters to ask students what they learned, how they learned it, why it's important, that meta-cognitive work. Authentic assessment, taking what we learn in the classroom and then putting it into a real-world context or a real-world-like context. And contract grading, which we've already heard a fair amount about, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it here, but this idea of task completion or labor or some more clear marker in that way. So after spending a lot of time reading about different approaches to ungrading, Christina and I came up with our pedagogical tenets, which include that evaluation criteria should be transparent to students from the jump. Students should be actively involved in the evaluative practice and process, and learning objectives should be clear and they should be relevant to students' lives.
Thank you, Andie. So based on those tenets, Andie and I came up with what we called contract-based grading. And it's not just contracts. As you can see, there are 4 key elements that we think are important to incorporate into your classrooms to really allow for what we aspire to in those world language classroom goals and objectives. So the first and foremost, we call it the invitation. One of the things about grading is that they never explain themselves. When a student gets into a classroom, the assumption is that they're going to get a grade and that will measure their evaluation. And that sort of perpetuates the normalization that grades measure learning. So from the very beginning, we invite students into the ungrading process. We give them an introductory article about ungrading versus grading. I use Dr. Bloom's introduction to their book. And then we also give them an introductory sort of reading on second language acquisition. And then we ask general questions about what is language learning, what makes it unique, how does grading limit that, and how does ungrading or how could ungrading make that more accessible? And so in the first couple of days of class, we brainstorm collaboratively sort of deliverables. Students come up with ideas on what they can do before class, during class, and outside of class. And then I translate those into a participation checklist that students interact with weekly, called the weekly participation blog. They check off the work that they've been doing. They don't need to check off a minimum amount. I say you can check none of them and you still get credit because you're doing it. And then secondly, in Paso Dos, step 2, they reflect on how they're feeling. So if they're feeling overwhelmed and they're not checking anything off the checklist, they know that they need to do more outside of class. Because students here are defining the parameters for participation, there's a lot more student buy-in from the very beginning of class in terms of, we know that ungrading is going to help us more than grades do. No system for evaluation is going to be perfect, but they know that grading doesn't work for language learning, and they're starting to get a better idea on how ungrading could work. The secondary element is a contract. So at the end of the day, our classrooms exist within a larger scope of grading at the university. We need to give them a grade. And so in order to combat that chaos and the potential of anxiety of introducing a new system, we provide contracts that organize a flexible template for language learning. So they're organized, they transmit clear course expectations, a certain amount of labor equals a certain grade, but they're flexible enough to have us focus on fluency over accuracy. We want students to make mistakes, navigate the language, make hypotheses about what structures could work. Also, because we know that language acquisition is going to vary, the flexibility of the contract allows those varieties to shine through in the classroom. And here's an example from Westfield State Spanish 4. We start by choosing on the left-hand column a series of assessments that align themselves with the world readiness standards. We don't weight them against each other. We look at all of these assessments as a collective amount of input and output that students can engage with throughout the semester. And then from there, we as instructors define 2 or 3 learning goals, which is essentially a percentage of the work that the students have to complete. And when we say complete, we mean complete to collaboratively defined and understood standards. We use the actual proficiency guidelines and the can-do statements to set those standards. In those goals, the students just have to complete a percentage of the work. So for instance, the weekly journal, there are 14 total opportunities. Students need to complete 12 out of 14, which is roughly 89% of the work. For learning goal 2, students do 10 out of 14, which is roughly 79% of the work. In this way, students are focused a little bit more on building healthy language habits, learning habits throughout the semester. However, again, we need to give them a grade. And so these 2 learning goals equals a C+ and a B+. At Westfield State, we allow the students to individualize the learning process, their language learning journey, via addendum opportunities. So if a student wants an A in the class, they need to complete learning goal 1, 89% of the work, and then they need to add on 3 addendum credits. The addendums are my favorite part of this contract process because it takes what students are already doing outside of class. I have a student who worked with someone who was Spanish speaking, and they're getting credit for doing that work outside of class. They're getting course credit for that. They can apply to have that count towards their course credit. Similarly, in students who maybe don't have a lot of contact outside the classroom with Spanish or whatever language, they're encouraged to find where they can interact with the language in the real world context. I generally provide a series of examples for students. So 1 credit is, for instance, attending a Spanish speaking event on campus. 2 credits is something that's more semester long, meaning subtitle showdown. They put all of their subtitles for the media they consume in Spanish. And then last but not least, they provide reflections on how whatever they're learning and whatever they're doing relates back to class. The next step in our process is collaborative rubric generation. I mentioned that the students are completing the contract to certain defined standards. We examine those industry standards via the proficiency guidelines from Axel and the can-do statements. So every time we have a larger assignment, we evaluate those standards together, we learn about them. We then consider the norms and objectives of the assessment for the class. We make some connections and comparisons, and ultimately, students end up building their own rubrics together in class, choosing a variety of categories, and then defining sufficient level of completion. So here's an example for a writing project. Students defined, there's just 2 of the examples. This rubric had 4 different categories, and then there was a section at the bottom for feedback. Students defined what content, what sufficient meant for content, what sufficient meant for comprehension. And then I translated, just like we did with the participation blog, I translated it into a product. I then helped them define insufficient and outstanding. I gave it to the students before they turned in their assignments. They voted, they said yes. And then when I go to grade their assignments, quote unquote, grade their assignments, I use this rubric they've created. So they created it, again, allowing student buy-in, autonomy. They can veto. I had one time they didn't even include grammar and they gave an excellent reasoning and we didn't include it on the rubric. So what they say goes. What's also important about this system in these rubrics and also overall in the class is that we use minimal grading so that we don't confuse students with too many options. We also don't confuse ourselves with too many options. What's the difference between an 83, 85, and 87? So you want to make sure that you use various scales. So a 3-tier scale, a 2-tier scale, grade-free zones, meaning you don't accept them or you don't grade anything, and 0 scale, you give work, but you don't evaluate it. And so it goes to building healthy habits. This all counts towards the work of the class. In our rubric, using the 3-tier scale, insufficient, sufficient, and outstanding, we give visual markers on where they're falling. And then importantly, if they've completed it to the sufficient standards, it's completed. There's feedback, there's still work to do, but they've met standards. If it doesn't get completed, it's try again. Overall in our course, the visual Overall in our course, the visual markers we use are check marks to say, yes, you've completed the work. X meaning that you just haven't turned it in. If we look at the contract, they don't need to turn in all of the work, so they're bound to get some X's. And then last but not least, try again. And then if you click on these blue dialog bubbles, the student feedback will pop up so they can focus more on their feedback than on a grade. That's what these visual markers in our learning management systems do.
Okay, so to end off, rather than us tell you how this has worked, we're going to give you the student voices. So student reactions. One student said, during this course, I learned that making mistakes shouldn't always be a deduction of points and shouldn't be a huge stress. It's okay and good to make mistakes because it can help you improve and learn. So we see that risk taking. I think it was great how the instructor asked us for our input when it came to grading projects, so we see that student involvement. I enjoy the contracts because of how clearly the sheet explains what tasks need to be completed to reach your goal grade. I think that grading was fair and just. It's a fun idea that can help people that might have a more busy schedule or have difficulties learning. The assessment process gave me the confidence I needed in order to want to improve, but also gave me the instruction on how to improve. And I felt comfortable trying more things in Spanish and was able to learn more. However, we don't want to just give you the rosy comments. There are some concerns that come up too. One student said the contract grading was somewhat confusing, as well as the fact that I prefer to just do my work and have that accurately reflect my understanding, which, as Susan Bloom said, you know, what is a B plus? It can be very, very variable, right? It was strange. I did not like contract grading. And the creme de la creme, while I understand the purpose of the contract grading, I am unsure how I like it in practice. Often the only things that end up actually putting a grade in our grade books is our daily participation points. It just doesn't quite sit right with me that I can complete all of the homework to the best of my abilities and have it minimally count toward my grade visually. I am sure that that's not actually what's occurring, but it's how it appears in Canvas. And it's rather disheartening, and while it sucks, it's obvious that the schooling system has conditioned us to equate our fundamental growth and worth to the GPA we receive. I just found the contract to make me more anxious than anything. So with this comment, we see that students are critically thinking about how they're evaluated and the broader context of grading and the problems. We see that they are maybe having some anxiety related to something that's different from the status quo. And we see that because of this dialogic talk, we've been able to make changes to our process and improve it and make it more clear and straightforward. This comment helped us to create the invitation that brings students in at the beginning of the semester as to why and how we do this. With that, I'll close. Thank you very much for listening, and